Let's take a look at Susan Wendell's text, Toward a Feminist Theory of Disability. This is an early text that came out sort of at the dawn of disability theory. There has been a great deal more work, although much more, of course, is needed in the area of disability studies and feminist disability studies since the time that Wendell's writing here. Her argument still holds true because there is still a need to merge the concerns being dealt with in disability studies into the mainstream of feminist theory. In this text, Wendell is arguing that we need a social and political feminist theory of disability that includes ethical, psychological, and epistemological aspects of living with disability. So we might ask ourselves, if there is an area of study called disability theories, why is Wendell concerned that theories of disability are taken up by feminist theorists? That is, why is this a feminist issue? Wendell thinks this is a feminist issue because feminists are already concerned about attitudes towards the body, because these kinds of attitudes are precisely what often contribute to women's oppression. Moreover, there's a more abstract issue that both feminists and disabled persons face. That is, whether to stress sameness among the members of the group disabled persons and women, or whether to stress difference among the members of that particular group. Now, we've already seen some accounts that discuss this, including Crenshaw, Spellman, Ogiyemi, and others. And so, along with the themes of dependency versus independence and integration versus separatism, the theme of sameness versus difference will run throughout the course of Wendell's text. But generally, Wendell is trying to argue here that the experience and knowledge of disabled persons needs to be integrated into feminist theory. And if we think about this, it ought to make sense. Given what we read, particularly in the race, oppression, and subjectivity section 2 of the course, from the Combahee River Collective, Crenshaw, Spellman, and Ogiyemi, accounting for the differences among the group women needs to include more than just gender oppression, because women also suffer racial oppression, class oppression, oppression based on disability, sexuality, age, and other kinds of oppressions. So in order to alleviate the oppression of women, feminism has to deal with more than just gender oppression. For this reason, Wendell argues that an adequate feminist account of disability requires a knowledge of differences in experience of persons with disabilities and a knowledge of the ways in which the oppression of the disabled interacts with sexism, racism, and class oppression. So Wendell begins by looking at the problems that we have as a society in defining disability. And she looks at the United Nations definition for disability, impairment, and handicap. And she finds these definitions problematic because the definitions of impairment and disability are stated in physical terms. That is, they rely on a kind of biologic, in Ogiyemi's language, as a restriction or a lack of ability, whereas handicap is based on a person's social roles. Their roles and expectations attributed to certain persons depending on whether they're male or female, whether they're old or young, whether they're a wife or husband, etc. So impairment and disability discuss bodies, whereas handicap discusses social roles and social environments. But as Wendell argues, not only are normal roles social, but normal structure and function and normal ability to perform some activity also depend upon the society in which the standards of normality are generated. So it's problematic that there's this idea that we have a universal biological or medical paradigm of human ability. It's an illusion. It's a social construction, much like beauty standards or gender roles or gender categories. So, as Ogiemi discusses in her piece, Wendell is claiming that based on the UN definitions, disability and impairment are defined by a kind of biologic. That is, they don't take account of the ways in which we socially construct or apply norms and ideals to certain body types. Rather, they locate a lack or loss in people's physical bodies. And one implication of this is that women and the elderly can be disabled when they can't do things that are not required by their social roles, yet they can't be handicapped. So, for example, she talks about how a blind woman who's not taught to read Braille would be disabled because of her blindness, but in a society that doesn't define her role as one that requires her to read, she would not be handicapped, though she would be disabled. And aging persons could also be disabled but not handicapped when they can no longer perform certain activities because those activities are not expected of the elderly. So the disability or the impairment would be a personal problem, not a social or structural problem. Disabled persons have a diversity of bodies and a diversity of struggles, and there's a shared oppression. However, we have to be careful in applying biologic to our definitions of disability and impairment. Further, definitions of disability problematize who is labeled as disabled, and such labeling has concrete effects in terms of resources, help, credibility, insurance, etc. So again, in light of Ogiemi's account, Wendell is arguing that the social construction of disability is constructed from what is taken to be a biological reality. But disability is not natural, per se. This relies on a problematic dualism between nature and culture, which has essentialized women's difference as natural rather than social difference. The disadvantages that we see persons with disabilities as having could just as easily be advantages, depending on our social construction of persons with disabilities, the social and physical environment, the way that we plan our spaces and architecture. And so disadvantages could just as easily be advantages, as she exemplifies with her example of Stephen Hawking. Hawking claims that he views his disability as increased ability. He has all the resources he needs to spend his time thinking, and as a theoretical physicist, this is actually an advantage for Hawking. He doesn't have to bother with many of the daily things that he had to deal with before contracting Lou Gehrig's disease. He now has other people doing these things for him, and he can spend his time focusing on physics. So for Hawking, his disadvantage or disability becomes an advantage because the environment, the architecture, the resources that he has socially support his disability in such a way that it becomes advantageous. Unfortunately, Hawking is seen as a kind of special case. Generally, people with disabilities don't have the resources and opportunities that are needed structurally to make their disability an advantage rather than a disadvantage. Moreover, when we allocate resources to disabled persons, they're seen as charity rather than deserved resources. Moreover, disability tends to be seen as a family problem rather than a social problem or a structural problem. Again, this goes back to the distinction between culture and nature, and the UN's definition of disability as a kind of physical impairment or lack, rather than as a social situation or a social structure. Yet, as Wendell points out, the physical conditions that disable persons are oftentimes a consequence of social arrangements, not merely of one's natural body. So the world is designed for young, able-bodied males. And many, if not most, able-bodied people do not want to hear about the experiences of disabled persons and the struggles caused by the body. We might sympathize, we might give to charity, but we can't empathize. And you should be thinking here of Lugonis's world traveling and loving perception. Instead of perceiving arrogantly, perceiving lovingly. That is, putting yourself in the position where you can see someone's experience from their perspective, rather than objectifying them. There's a capacity for empathy for persons with disability, but because we're afraid that we won't have control over the body, that disabled bodies bring up a kind of ontological possibility that bodies can't be completely controlled, that bodies do get sick, that bodies do come down with illnesses, that bodies do not live forever. So this inability to control the body is despised and feared in our society. Our society thrives on ideal notions of bodies, and medical institutions, institutions of health and institutions of fitness, institutions of beauty, all kinds of institutions that focus on controlling the body, from plastic surgery to the diet industry, one of the big industries in our society. We have this idea that we can control our body rather than thinking that we ought to adjust the social world to accommodate the bodies that are already in the world. We have cultural attitudes toward the body that are oppressive and that alienate both the disabled and the able-bodied. So real bodies are exceedingly diverse, yet the body is idealized through appearance, function, and control. And this goes not merely for disability, but again, you can think back to Fausto Sterling's argument, to Butler's argument, to the movie XXY, to Ogiyemi's argument, and you should be able to see that the ways in which bodies show up in the world don't match the categories, the social categories in which we place bodies and sort bodies out into social groups. Oftentimes, being close enough to some ideal postpones identifying with our real bodies. And not being able to identify with our real bodies is alienating for all of us, disabled and non-disabled. Disabled women, for example, don't feel seen. They're often not seen by others as whole persons. They're often desexualized and infantilized, not seen as autonomous, not seen as having agency, objectified, perceived arrogantly, based on a kind of biologic that is at play in our society. So social ideals are not natural, but they're social creations that oppress everyone because these social ideals are alienating. Physically disabled persons in pain remind able-bodied people of the inevitability of pain. It's inevitable. At some point in our lives, nearly all of us are going to be ill, either temporarily or chronically. At some time in our lives, we're going to experience pain. We're going to experience disability, impairment, unless we die very young and healthy. But most of us who live to age will experience various kinds of disabilities. And when we see physically disabled persons, and we see their embodiment, we see their pain, this reminds us of the inevitability of pain. And so in our society, there's a kind of ideal that takes physical vigor to be not merely an ideal of health and fitness, but to be a moral virtue. This is in tension with the fact that complete control over the body is an absolute myth. Nobody has complete control over their bodies. And this myth of control over the body has been medicalized. Again, recall Fausto Sterling's account of the medicalization of intersex infants. That's nothing more than an exercise in control. So medicine is seen as this kind of heroic control and maintenance of ideal bodies. Yet, most people know little about living with long-term or life-threatening illness. Most people know little about how to talk to their doctors, how to live with limitation, how to live with uncertainty about their health, how to live with pain that can't be controlled by doctors or medications. And so one consequence of biologic or biological ideals about bodies is that disabled persons are othered. Able-bodied persons tend to other people as objects of our experience. Again, recall Beauvoir and Lugones. Beauvoir's account of self and other, and Lugones' account of arrogant perception. This kind of othering people as objects of our experience, involves refusing them a kind of subjectivity and agency. It marginalizes them, which results in real, concrete, social, economic, and psychological oppression for persons with disabilities. Also, disabled heroes like Stephen Hawking further the marginalization of most disabled persons through the myth of control. Most disabled persons can't control their environment, can't control the amount of resources that they have, can't control the way that society will respond to them, can't control the fact that they will be othered. And so Wendell also argues that the term differently abled implies the same kind of normative ideal. Ultimately, she rejects the term differently abled. However, she does want to say that differences among persons with disabilities ought to be emphasized, not their similarities. Although there is a shared oppression, it's important to recognize that persons with disabilities embody various kinds of bodies and have various kinds of struggles and experiences of pain. And so assimilation doesn't challenge the framework of ideal bodies. So rather than assimilate persons into a single homogeneous category, she argues that we have to attend to the differences among persons in the group, much like Crenshaw's account, when Crenshaw argues for the intersectional approach. Acknowledging differences is necessary to undermine the existing value structure that supports ideal bodies that can be controlled. And so Wendell argues that whether one wants to emphasize sameness or difference in dealing with being the other depends in part upon how radically one wants to challenge the value structure of the dominant group. Now, again, you might think about de Beauvoir, who wanted to emphasize sameness, that we ought to transcend our difference as others and become subjects, that is, become like male subjects, and accounts like Crenshaw's that argue that we have to look at women as they are socially located and experiencing distinct challenges. Wendell is making the claim here, like Crenshaw, that we should not emphasize sameness, but we should emphasize difference. Only by doing that can we actually, on Crenshaw's view, alleviate the oppression of actual women, real women, and on Wendell's view, undermine the value structure of the dominant group, in this case, able-bodied persons. Wendell also argues that there are really important epistemic possibilities for disabled persons. That is, being disabled is a kind of standpoint. It's a kind of location from which persons with disabilities have access to knowledge that able-bodied persons don't have. And so the particularity of the experiences of disabled persons transcends the ideals and myths about bodies. For example, she discusses how many disabled persons are well aware that orgasms aren't experienced solely in the genitals. And this is the kind of knowledge that one can come to by being differently embodied. So being embodied as a disabled person is not necessarily simply oppressive or simply negative or simply disadvantageous. In fact, in thinking about knowledge, being embodied as a disabled person offers a lot of opportunities to know things that we might not otherwise know. As Wendell argues, and we'll see that Garland Thompson will also argue for this, there could be an explosion of knowledge, and this explosion of knowledge could come out against the cognitive authority of medicine. Again, there should be an echo of Fausto Sterling here. In taking the position or the location of an intersex person has access to knowledge and experiences that others don't have access to. And so this can allow for knowledge production that might work against the cognitive authority of medicine. And that's exactly what's been happening in terms of the advocates of persons born intersex. And so this asks us to think carefully about the question, who has the authority to know? When we tend to hold ideal body types or ideal social categories based on ideal body types, in contradistinction to body types which we other and refuse subjectivity to, we ought to think about just who it is that has the authority to know and produce knowledge rather than produce ignorance in this society, in our society. As Wendell says, quote, "When you are forced to realize that other people have more social authority than you do to describe your experience of your own body, your confidence in yourself and your relationship to reality is radically undermined." End quote. In conclusion, Wendell's arguing here that we need to work on theories of disability for the liberation of both disabled and able-bodied people, because theories of disability can help us to demystify and understand and come to know more about bodies that are oppressed and alienated. Real bodies are constantly changing. Real bodies don't represent the ideal social categories that we come up with. We don't have proper control of bodies. These notions that we can control bodies come to us through advertising, media, consumer products, medicine, the diet industry, beauty standards, gender roles, and they're oppressive to persons with disabilities, and on Wendell's view, they're oppressive to people who are able-bodied because they alienate everyone from their real bodies. So it's a kind of undermining of agency. So idealizations of the body, or idealizations of social categories, prevent everyone from identifying with and loving their own bodies.